Good afternoon, everyone, for another installment of the Land Use and Ethics Subcommittee. Just want to start off by saying that this subcommittee is going to reach peak levels of busyness over the next couple weeks before crossover. Today's work session has, I think, the most bills assigned to discuss maybe than I've ever seen in my time on the committee and the subcommittee. And that workload is going to continue. So we're going to keep hold tight on this noon date. Next week, we may be on the floor too long to meet at noon. We may have to meet a little bit later. We're going to try to keep this sort of early afternoon trend going as much as we can, but we might have to replicate last week at some point and meet maybe in the late afternoon or early evening in addition to an early afternoon meeting just to make sure we finish all of our bills. So hold tight. We've got a lot of important and big bills coming down the pike. So with that brief preamble, let's move on to our first bill of the day, which is going to be House Bill 225. This is a departmental bill that makes a variety of changes to the Smart Growth Subcabinet. Namely, it makes the Secretary of Planning, Secretary Flora is actually here with us today, makes her the new chair of the Smart Growth Subcabinet. It makes the Secretary of DHCD the vice chair. It adds the Secretary of Emergency Management to the subcabinet. It removes the Special Secretary of Smart Growth in the subcabinet, and then it also clarifies that the subcabinet's goal is to work on issues of equity and resiliency. And yeah, if you want to just scroll through so that everyone can kind of see what we're doing here. There's the omission or the deletion of the special secretary. We're calling it the Sustainable Growth Subcabinet now. Lots of different things about sustainable replacing smart and various references to the code. There's the portion where we're going to add the Secretary of Emergency Management in this bill to the subcabinet, and then you can keep going. There's the part about the chair and the vice chair. Here's we're adding words like sustainable again in favor of smart, talking a lot about vitality instead of conservation. Okay, and so with that, I see you, Delegate Foley, but I think since we are not often honored by the president of by the presence of a cabinet secretary, I'd like to kick it over to Secretary Flora just to regale us with anything I missed in my description of the bill, and maybe also just remind us of a little bit of the impetus of it, because it has been a while since we had this bill hearing. Secretary Flora, if you could just briefly get into that, that would be great. And thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Yes, great. Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity. Hello, everyone. You have a lot on your plate, so I'll try to keep this fairly short. As we came into planning, it was fairly evident that the Office of Smart Growth that was created by Governor Glendening actually has never existed as an Office of Smart Growth ever since the end of his administration. It was actually in the governor's office at that point in time and has not existed there ever since. So a lot of what you're seeing here is to update the reality of how this actually functions. It was moved over to the Maryland Department of Planning, and essentially doesn't exist as an office. The other aspect of this is that there was a special secretary created, which made sense when it was in the governor's office, but it no longer made sense to have a special secretary to oversee this subcabinet when it was no longer in office of the governor. And in all reality, basically the Secretary of the Department of Planning hasn't since been serving as acting chair, but for the most recent administration. And when that was actually reactivated again, it served that way, but it was really very awkward and wasn't working well, quite frankly. I can go into more detail if you would like. The other things are essentially updates to essentially the whole profession. The realm of smart growth is something that was very much of the time, and we were great leaders in that, but we've evolved. And we did have a letter of support from former Governor Glendenning about this evolution from smart to sustainable growth, which really picks up not only where we grow, but a little bit more specific to how we grow. We're incorporating equity and resiliency as very, issues that we need to be mindful at this point in time. So those are integrated along with the recommendation to include the Secretary of Maryland Department of Emergency Management. So those are really the big things. I would say the only other thing I would add is by shifting the reality of the chair over to the Secretary of Planning, which is kind of how it functions, we felt that the most appropriate thing would then to be move the Secretary of Department of Housing and Community Development to the vice chair position, because those two agencies really do kind of work most closely on a lot of these issues. And I think that's the summary.
Awesome. Great. That's very helpful. And I would also just say for the subcommittee's benefit that this bill has no fiscal impact. It has no amendments. The testimony was all favorable, and it's already passed the Senate unanimously. So with that, Delegate Foley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to move the bill favorable.
Okay.
Second.
There's been a motion favorable and a second. Is there any discussion on the bill? Seeing no hands, all those in favor of House Bill 225, please raise your hand or say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? All right, bill is going to receive a favorable recommendation from the subcommittee. Thank you, Secretary Flora, for joining us and offering that background. We're going to move on to our next bill for the day. That's going to be House Bill 860 about community action boards. So the issue here basically is that community action boards, I believe there are about 17 of them across the state. They receive federal funding and then they distribute it out mostly to nonprofits or other groups across the state. But depending on where you are in the state, sometimes it's been difficult for community action boards to fill up. There are not enough dedicated members of the community that want to serve on these boards. And part of the reason is because some of the requirements of how many people have to serve on these boards, they're higher under state law than they are in federal law. So what this bill does is adopt federal standards for tripartite boards for community action boards in Maryland. The goal here is just to make sure we can get all these boards fully staffed up and they can do the important work of channeling and funneling federal funds to the organizations that need them. There's no fiscal impact, of course. There is no cross-file. The testimony was all favorable and there's no amendments. Is there any discussion about House Bill 860?
Move favorable.
Second.
There's been a favorable motion and a second. Is there any final discussion or does anyone want to discuss it before we vote? Yes, Delegate Davis.
Just a point of information. What is a tripartite board? I have no idea.
Yeah, that's a good question. Ben, do you know? I mean, tripartite generally is the definition is something involving three parties.
Yep.
Ben, do you know exactly what the origin there is?
Yeah. And Colleen, maybe if you go to page 2 at the bottom, thank you very much. There is a reference there under and then that's a federal regulation, federal code site, which is in keeping with the general understanding about what a tripartite board means. Having said all that, I was looking at the citation, and it's also mentioned briefly in the fiscal note as well for the bill. But as it has been discussed, its members are selected by the organization and composed to ensure that at least 1/3 of the members are chosen in accordance with democratic selection procedures, adequate to assure that the members are representative of low-income individuals and families in the neighborhoods that are served, reside in the neighborhood served, are able to participate actively in the development, planning, evaluation of programs funded under this. So
yeah, that's right. So yeah, the answer basically, I'd forgotten that. Thank you, Ben. The answer is basically that the tripartite, the three parties here that are part of tripartite boards are affected communities. So in this case, low-income individuals, elected officials, and third, members of the private sector. So the business community as well. Those are the three parts that make up tripartite boards. Delegate
Thank
Foley.
you.
Yeah,
And
thanks.
what do they do?
They decide which projects will receive federal funding. They evaluate nonprofits and their effectiveness. They look at studies about empirically about which nonprofits are functioning well, and they decide which ones will receive federal funding.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Any other further comments? All right, there is a motion favorable that has been properly seconded. All those in favor of House Bill 860, please raise your hand or say aye.
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 Any opposed? All right. That bill will also receive a favorable recommendation from the subcommittee. We're going to move on to the next bill. We're moving right along here. House Bill 873. So this bill does have a cross file. What this stems from is a program that we passed last year called the Appraisal Gap from Historic Redlining Financial Assistance Program. The idea here was to provide some state funding for projects in formerly redline communities. I think everyone knows what redline means, but if you don't, I'm happy to try to explain it. But these are formerly redline communities, and the program was meant to basically renovate homes in those areas so that they would be brought up to code and could be purchased. What this bill from Delegate Taylor does is to make homeowners eligible to receive funding from this program so that they can purchase the renovated homes. That's all it does. It just expands eligibility of the program. Instead of just developers or whomever getting it to make the renovations, now regular Marylanders will also be able to receive money from this fund to buy the renovated homes in formerly redline communities. So it is a very small piece, I think, to solving the myriad housing crises, the interlocking housing crises that we've been talking about in this subcommittee and the full committee this session. Do we have any questions?
Move favorable.
There's a favorable motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. So this has been moved favorable. It's been seconded. I would again note that, there are no amendments and that the testimony was all favorable. There's no opposition. Any final discussion? Seeing none. All those in favor of this bill, please raise your hand or signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Anyone need to be recorded? No. Seeing none, that bill will also, HB 873, will receive a favorable recommendation from the subcommittee as well. We're going to move on to House Bill 891. This bill relates to the Seed Community Development Anchor Institution Fund. I could explain it, but I think someone better qualified to explain it is on the call. So, Chair Holmes, do you want to talk a little bit about your bill?
Let's let Ben take care of that.
Okay, all right, Ben, give it a shot.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. So, looking at the bill, we have the bill expanding the purpose and use of the fund and DHCD to include grants and loans to anchor institutions. And that's pretty much, all it does. Colleen, maybe if you could please go to page 2. So yeah, and right there is good. You see how it's kind of just sort of maybe tweaking that first part there. Right now, there's these anchor institutions, and its current law is just for the institution, but this is for the departments, their foundations, things like maybe there's, just an example like a nonprofit or some sort of, LLC or agency that's within the institution of higher education. And so this way, or the hospital institution in the state. And so in that way, it helps with giving more flexibility. Not everything has to come right from the top of the institution. Yeah. And then it also adds some language about sustainable communities.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, basically just does two things, folks. It basically just expands the people that can get the money under this fund from just the higher education institute and just the hospital to their affiliated groups, their foundations, their other things. So that's just kind of honestly a clerical technical tweak to make sure the right entities can apply for the funds. And the only other difference it makes is it expands the universe of where these funds are going to be pumped into from just what are called blighted areas to also this new definition, which we have codified already, of a sustainable community. So it expands it to not just blighted, but also sustainable communities. And as I think we've talked about before, sustainable communities has a specific definition, but is across the state, is not reserved to just our urban areas. Delegate Naraki.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a point of clarification, when we talk about hospital institutions and their affiliated kind of arms, I'll describe it that way. Like I have a Kennedy Krieger facility in my district. Would a facility like that be able to receive funding since they are, affiliated with a hospital institution?
I would assume that the answer is yes under the provision that says other entities of the institution, but Chairman Holmes may want to correct me. Delegate Holmes.
And Delegate Stewart, you are exactly correct, because it is affiliated with the hospital, so they would be able to receive the funds, Delegate Naraki.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Good question. Okay, and any other questions about this bill? I will note that on the last couple of votes, a few members had their cameras off, which is, fine if you want to be here and be present and have your camera off, but we cannot record you as voting if you do not have your camera on when we vote. So that's just FYI. I'm not going to presume that people are a yes or a no if I can't physically see them. So that when we're doing these votes, all those votes were counted. They had a majority of the subcommittee, but I'm not counting votes from people with their camera off, just FYI. Okay, any last discussion?
Move favorable on HB 891 in spite of the sponsor.
Yeah, we do have a big sponsor problem. That's true.
Second.
I didn't acknowledge that. And it's been moved favorable and it's been properly seconded. And I would note that this bill has also already passed the Senate unanimously. It also has no amendments and no fiscal impact. Any last chances to say anything? Seeing none, all those in favor of House Bill 891, please raise your hand or say aye.
Aye.
Is anyone opposed? All right, that bill, HB 891, will also receive a favorable recommendation from the subcommittee. Now, moving on to a relative, I guess, behemoth bill, at least in relation to some of those bills, we're going to move to HB 599, which is one of the three bills in the governor's housing package. If you guys remember, we discussed this last week. HB 599 basically at its core establishes what's called a community development entity or corporation, the purpose of which would be to apply for what are called new markets tax credits at the federal level. And we discussed a little bit about how we don't really have a statewide entity to try to go after these funds. We're leaving them on the table as a result. There are some entities that operate within the state that apply for them. But the important thing to remember about these types of funds is they're not allocated by the state. So just because if we add this CDE in Maryland, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's competing with other CDEs in the state because everyone is trying to go for a large federal pool of money. So adding another qualified CDE in Maryland could actually increase our share of the pot without sort of crowding out funding for other entities. So I'll just mention that off the top because we discussed that issue a little bit last week. The other issue that we discussed about this bill last week relates to the portion that talked about the strategic demolition fund. We've gone back and forth with both the governor's administration and DHCD, as well as the Appropriations Committee and other counsel within the House of Delegates about this issue because there is a concern that we are essentially using debt to pay for debt. And we broached that a little bit last week. And with that, I think I'm going to shut up and let Ben talk through sort of what we're hearing on that issue, if you don't mind, Ben.
Mr. Chair, before you do that, I just got a message from Delegate Lehman that she got thrown off of the call. So she's trying to get back in. So I don't know if somebody's monitoring that. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll add her. She hasn't asked to come back in. And we still easily have quorum, so we'll we won't vote without her. But yeah, Ben, do you want to talk through this? We'll start with this debt for debt issue.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And Colleen, could you please go to the very end of the bill? And then maybe this page 16, actually. Yeah. So yeah, and that's great. So this is one example of the usage, but of what we're talking about, and that the chair had mentioned. As the chair was saying, there's a couple of concerns. One is just a broad precedent where every bill or program is looking at mirroring this language in a similar way, where we have the fund may be used to provide grants and loans to government agencies for various projects, including debt payments. But that presents an issue with using the debt in this way. And in theory, this could be something that's continued by every program, and would set a bad precedent. And then there's just the general issue of with bondholders, and when bonds are being issued, there's often restrictions on these bonds, which in general prohibits the use of bond issuances and debt this way to be used for additional debt. So those are kind of the two big issues with that. And that's why we have the proposed amendment in front of us now, striking the language. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, basically the issue here, folks, is that we can legally do this. So from the standpoint of like the attorney general or whatever, we can legally authorize debt for debt payments within the strategic demolition fund. It's not any legality problem. It's an issue of whether we want to set a precedent or to further, precedent from long ago that this is something that we habitually do. And when we go down that road, there is a concern from people way smarter about the budget than me that it threatens our AAA bond rating, because once the ratings agencies realize that this is something that we are willing to pursue and that this could lead to, normalization of this type of procedure, then it could yield bad results. So the First Amendment we're going to discuss is basically just, as you see here, striking debt payments and putting credit enhancement to get rid of this debt for debt issue. Does anyone have any more questions on that? All right. Do I hear any motions on the Delegate Davis?
Sorry for the delayed hand raising. How's the administration on the amendment?
Yeah, I'm happy to kick it. There's another amendment that I was gonna kick it over to the administration. I know that we have Brad Fallon from the governor's office, and we have a couple of representatives from DHCD on the call. My understanding, they can correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that obviously they would like some more permissive language in here, basically directing the treasurer not to make these payments if they think that there's going to be a problem. But we ran that sort of more permissive language back to the Appropriations Committee, and they still think that it's problematic from a bond rating perspective. So I think they don't love this, but I also don't think that this is a huge deal for them. But I will kick it over to Brad or anyone else who want to express the administration's position on this before we vote.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Just this amendment first. Yeah, go ahead, Brad.
Absolutely. No, but thank you, Mr. Chair. I mean, the way you explained it is exactly right. We worked with the state treasurer's office as well as our CFO and our DHCD's assistant attorney general to determine a path forward so that these can only happen if the state treasurer's office is comfortable with the source of the revenue into the SDF, so that we don't have that debt for debt issue. We would certainly prefer the secondary amendment that I know we'll go through in just a moment. But if the debt payments is struck, we can also live with that, right? So, but thank you for throwing it to me.
Yeah, of course, and thank you as always for joining us, Brad. Delegate Naraki.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Could we get a definition of what a credit enhancement is, just so we're all on the same page? Just want to make sure I know exactly what that is in the new language there in the amendment.
Yeah, that's a good question. Ben, do you have that? Because I believe this language came over from Approps, but it's also possible for someone in the administration can explain it too.
And if I just, I'm happy, Brad's definitely very informed on this. I would add the credit enhancement, for what it's worth, is part of the existing bill. It was just the issue with the debt payment, and then I'm looking at the exactly what that means right now.
Got it. Yeah. I mean, my understanding of credit enhancement is always basically like a complex financial strategy meant to include and improve the credit profile of a business. So basically, like you boost using funding, you boost the sort of overall like debt to income or equity profile of a business to improve its overall credit profile, which oftentimes allows it to like get like better interest rates. But yeah, Brad, go ahead. Yeah. Tell me if I'm wrong there.
No, you were exactly right. So,
Okay.
Doug and Rocky, what that would look like is, say, a loan loss reserve account or some sort of reserve that helps secure a loan so that they can get a more favorable interest rate because the lender has some sort of recourse at the back end. So, this is use that money to be able to leverage so that we can bring in additional dollars, essentially, as we address particularly things like vacants in Baltimore.
Thank you, Brad.
Thanks, Brad. Yeah,
Absolutely.
my securities law professor is going to be really proud of me that I retained some of that information back from like 2012. Okay. So I think we'll go ahead and vote on this. I definitely appreciate and respect that, the administration doesn't love it, but I think that, we're being sort of handed this by kind of the appropriating powers that be that are really concerned if we don't do this. So is there a motion on the amendment?
Move the amendments, Mr. Chair.
Thank
Second.
you. There's been a motion and a second. All those in favor of just this amendment, please raise your hand or signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All right, looks like that's a majority. We're going to adopt that amendment. All right, we're going to move on
Proposed amendment,
to,
Mr. Chair.
we got a couple more amendments. I appreciate that, that initiative, Delegate Holmes. I think we've got one other amendment I want to go through, which is from DHCD and from the administration. And it's actually sort of originates, I think, over on the Senate side, if I remember correctly, and it deals with both sort of Maryland pride, I would say, and then it also deals with sort of prioritizing certain communities. If Brad, you again, or someone from the agency wants to talk through that, we'll try to get it up on the screen for you. Let's see. Darren or Colleen, I can email it to you if you don't have
And
this
I can
Okay,
share
you've got
it
it then? Okay, got it.
And just as a background, this is the one, Brad, that you're probably familiar. Yeah, you've been working with the Senate amendment on, and
Yeah,
that you were
exactly.
helpfully coordinating on. So let me try. Oh, I think Colleen has it now, actually. I can pull up the reprint if that's better, whatever you guys want.
Yeah, no, that works. I think this works for now, and then we can just have Brad explain. But basically, the idea here from the Senate is just to make sure there's geographic proportional representation, including of low-income communities, which would be the site of a lot of this funding, to make sure that those communities have a voice at the table. And then if you want to keep scrolling down, Darren, and then it says that the committee, this is the committee that's running the CDE, is going to prioritize projects owned or operated by entities that have their principal place of business in the state. So this is the Maryland pride angle that I was talking about, that we want to make sure that if we're pumping these federal dollars into entities, we want to make sure that these are Maryland businesses first and foremost before we're empowering a more hated rival like Virginia, God forbid, or something like that. Keep scrolling down, Darren. And again, really just geographic representation here. And again, repeating the same thing in a different section. Brad, what do we miss?
Nothing other than that we do not want to invest in the state that shall not be named to the south. The other kind of side of that is to ensure that if there are companies or really organizations that are active around the country, that priority goes to projects funded by businesses here because it has the largest economic impact for Marylanders.
Exactly.
That was really right. It came from the Senate. So
yeah,
thank you.
For sure. I think that's a very smart amendment from Senator Augustine, one of our friends over from the Senate. And we will get a little bit of a nice multiplier effect there by prioritizing Maryland businesses. And once Virginia, ponies up their metro funding, we'll continue. We'll start hating Pennsylvania the most. But I had to mention that for the chair's benefit. Okay, so I think this is a pretty reasonable amendment. We know that it's going to be attached to the Senate side bill anyways. So in the interest of sort of alignment and conformity with what they're thinking across the street, is there a motion on the amendment?
So moved.
Second.
All right, this amendment has been moved and properly seconded. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye or raise your hand.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, that amendment's going to be adopted too. All right, so Ben, I think that's all. I may be forgetting one, but I think we've got the debt for debt, and we've got the amendment out of the way, and then we've got the Senate amendment out of the way, and I think that's it. But Ben, am I forgetting one? Okay, that's it. All right, any final discussion on the bill as amended now that we've made these two, I think, relatively simple amendments?
Move the bill as amended.
Second.
All right, the bill has been moved and properly seconded as a whole. Any last thoughts or concerns about HB 599 before we vote? Seeing none. All those in favor of HB 599, please raise your hand or signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? All right, this bill will also receive a favorable recommendation from the subcommittee. That's it. We did a very nice job working through the longest agenda in the subcommittee's recent history in just over 30 minutes. But don't get too comfortable. Our work will continue. We might meet again next week, but I think it's more likely that in 1 week on Tuesday, we'll have 1 or 2 meetings. We will be finally taking up HB 538, which is the other piece of the governor's package that's assigned to us, which is his zoning related bill. I think that we're going to be talking through that. If you have, I know a number of you have brought concerns about that bill or thoughts about how to change it to me separately. Continue to do so. That will be part of an iterative process around that bill, really probably for the next couple of weeks, but we will start talking about that, I believe, next week in the subcommittee. So with that, we are adjourned. I will see you guys in 25 minutes.